The rescue signal came through at 0400 ship time, when most of the crew aboard the GCS Undying Mercy were either deep in sleep rotation or running quiet maintenance checks in the lower decks. And the sound of it cut through the silence like a cold blade dragged across metal. Navigator Korath Sen was the first to pick it up, his four-fingered hands moving fast across the console as the beacon frequency locked in. And he called the bridge to attention without raising his voice, because Korath crew members never raised their voices unless a cub was in danger. Commander Velsharath arrived on the bridge within 2 minutes, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark green scales catching the blue light of the navigation screens. And he studied the readout with the particular stillness his species was known for. The kind of stillness that looked like calm, but was actually extreme concentration. Colony transport, Korath Sen said. Outer spiral registration, hull class, Meridian 4. She took debris damage from a fragment cloud. Propulsion is gone, and life support is running on backup cells. The commander looked at the life sign count on the screen, 22 signals in total, and he gave a single slow nod before turning to issue the intercept order. The Undying Mercy was a coalition medical frigate, long and white and built for exactly this kind of work. Her crew trained in multi-species emergency response, her medical bays stocked for a dozen different biologies, her corridors wide enough for a Valhari in full ceremonial stance. And she moved toward the distress signal with quiet efficiency, because this was routine, because this was what she was built for. What was not routine became clear the moment the boarding team cracked the damaged transport's main airlock. The smell hit them first, something warm and sweet that none of the Korath team could immediately identify. And then the sound followed, a high-layered mix of voices that were small and sharp and completely unpredictable in their pitch. And then the team saw them. 14 human children. They were pressed together near the back of the transport's main cabin, some standing, some sitting on the floor, some clinging to each other, ranging in size from very small to slightly less small, and in front of them, standing with her arms slightly out at her sides, in the universal posture of someone who has been keeping things calm through sheer will alone, was a human woman in a medic's uniform. She had short dark hair, tired eyes, and the expression of a person who had been solving small emergencies for the past 18 hours without rest. Sergeant Dara Osei, she said, Colonial Medical Corps. I have 14 juvenile passengers, ages 3 through 9, all physically stable. We had 1 stress fracture, 1 minor laceration, and approximately 40 instances of crying, all resolved. Stood very still. The children stared at them. One of the smaller children, a girl with 2 braids and a gap where her front teeth should have been, pointed at the nearest Korath officer and said something in a fast, bright voice that the translation unit rendered as, "He is very big and green. I like him." The Korath officer, a senior medic named Vreth Karal, did not know how to respond to this, so he looked at Sergeant Osei instead. Sergeant Osei rubbed her face with one hand and said, "They are going to do that a lot. I am sorry in advance." The transfer took just under an hour. The children were moved through the docking corridor in a supervised line, most of them walking, 2 of the smallest ones carried by Sergeant Osei, and 1 boy of about 7 who insisted on walking backwards the entire way because he wanted to watch the damaged transport through the porthole. The Korath crew watched this process from every available angle. Vel Sharath met Sergeant Osei at the end of the docking corridor himself, which was not standard procedure for a commanding officer, but the commander was Korath, and the sight of 14 cubs moving through his ship had activated something deep and automatic in him that no amount of training fully suppressed. "They will be safe aboard this vessel," he told her, and he meant it with every nerve in his body. "We will reach the Coalition way station in 72 hours. Until then, all resources of this ship are at your disposal." Sergeant Osei looked up at him. He was nearly twice her height, and she nodded with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Commander. I only ask one thing." "Name it." She paused, and she chose her next words carefully, the way a person chooses their footing on uncertain ground. "They are children, human children, and human children are not fragile in the way you might expect them to be. They are loud, and they move fast, and they bump into things and fall over and make messes, and all of that is normal. All of that is fine. None of it is an emergency." The commander looked at her steadily. "I say this," she continued, "because I have worked with coalition crews before, and I have seen what happens when a Korath crew sees a human child fall down. And I need you to know, with respect, that we do not need Code 7 when a child trips on a step." Velsharath was quiet for a moment, and then he straightened to his full height and said with great dignity, "Sergeant Osei, the crew of the Undying Mercy are trained professionals. We are entirely capable of maintaining appropriate response calibration in all circumstances." She looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," she said. She did not look entirely convinced. The children were settled into Observation Lounge C, which was the largest open room on the ship, not currently in use. The crew had cleared it quickly, efficiently, and someone had brought extra blankets. And someone else had brought approximately 6 times more food than 14 children could eat in a day. And a third someone had quietly added soft padding along the lower edges of every hard surface in the room. Sergeant Osei noticed all of this and said nothing, because she recognized the behavior for what it was. The Velkarath had already started, that deep biological current in every Korath nervous system that fired when a cub was nearby. The one that said protect and guard and watch and do not look away. It had no off switch and no volume control. And every Korath on the ship was already running a low hum of it, just from the sounds coming through the corridor walls. Sergeant Osei set up the cots in a neat row, handed out rations, organized the children's small bags along one wall, and then sat down on the floor in the middle of the room, and let the children climb on her for a few minutes, because they had been frightened and cramped for 18 hours, and they needed it. Through the observation lounge window, 3 Korath crew members stood in the corridor. They were not staring, they were monitoring. That was a completely different thing. By the second morning aboard the Undying Mercy, the crew had developed a rotation. It was unofficial. Nobody had written it into the duty schedule. But if you walked past Observation Lounge C at any point during the day, you would always find at least 2 Korath crew members stationed in the corridor outside the window, standing very still, watching the children with the focused attention of individuals who had been professionally trained to monitor critical situations. This was not surveillance. The commander had been very clear about that in the morning briefing. It was simply that crew members kept finding reasons to be in that particular corridor, and once they were there, they found it very difficult to leave. Chief Engineer Dareth Khan had come to check a ventilation coupling near the lounge at 700 hours, and had still been standing there at 900 hours, coupling forgotten in his hand, watching a small boy stack empty ration boxes into a tower. Korath Sen had logged 3 separate visits to a relay panel that required no actual maintenance. Even Dr. Sivrath, the ship's Prethian chief medical officer, who was amphibious and slightly translucent, and generally unmoved by most things, had positioned a monitor station in the corridor, under the stated purpose of tracking ambient humidity levels near the guest quarters, which was not a thing the ship had ever tracked before. Sergeant Osei noticed all of this. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change it. The Korath were not being intrusive, and the children were not being disturbed. In fact, most of the children had already noticed their audience, and accepted it, with the easy adaptability that human children apply to almost everything strange. All except one. Mira was 9 years old, the oldest of the group, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's complete inability to resist an opportunity. And on the second morning, she noticed the watchers in the corridor window, and she made a decision. She waited until she had an audience of 4. Then she did a cartwheel. A slow, wobbling, arms everywhere cartwheel that ended with her landing sideways on a pile of blankets with a theatrical grunt of pain that was at least 60% performance. The biometric sensors in the ship's corridor registered a 38% spike in collective Korath stress levels in under 2 seconds. 2 crew members physically stepped forward before they stopped themselves. Mira sat up, completely unharmed, grinning. She did it again the next morning, this time adding a fake stumble at the end, and the stress spike hit 41%, and Dr. Sivrath logged it as a recurring anomaly in the environmental health report. Sergeant Osei caught Mira practicing her routine on the afternoon of the second day, and sat down next to her on the floor. "You know what you are doing," Osei said. "Not a question." Mira arranged her face into an expression of complete innocence. "I am just playing. You are stress testing the crew." A pause, then a small smile. "They always watch. It is funny when they panic." Sergeant Osei looked at the window. 2 Korath officers were visible, watching with the particular alertness of people who had seen Mira stand up from that corner of the room before, and were already tensed for what might follow. "They are not panicking," Osei said. "They are worried about you. That is different. Worried means they care, and I need you to not use that against them." Mira was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was actually thinking about something, and then she nodded, slowly, with the specific seriousness that 9-year-olds produce when an adult has said something that lands. "Okay," she said. "But they are still funny." "Yes," Osei agreed, "they are still funny." Other end of the lounge, an entirely separate situation was developing. Bex was 3 years old, the youngest of the group, and she had the round, solemn face of a child who took everything very seriously, including things that did not require seriousness, like choosing which sock to put on first, and deciding which direction to enter a room from, and the placement of her personal water cup. The water cup was important. It was a small blue cup with a lid that did not fully seal, and it had come with Bex from the transport, tucked inside her small bag alongside a worn cloth rabbit and 2 crayon nubs, and it was hers in the deep, complete way that very young children own certain objects, not just possession, but identity. On the morning of the second day, Sergeant Osei had gathered the children and given them the ship rule. "Do not touch anything you did not bring with you," and she had said it clearly and twice, and most of the children had nodded and moved on. Bex had listened to this rule with enormous concentration. Her small forehead creased, her cup held in both hands, and she had turned it over in her mind for a long moment before arriving at her conclusion. Her cup was something she brought with her. Her cup was therefore allowed. She carried it everywhere. She carried it to breakfast and back. She carried it during the quiet hour after lunch, when Sergeant Osei made everyone rest. She carried it to the porthole corner, where she liked to sit and look at the stars, which she called the Big Dark with lights in it. She carried it when she walked the length of the lounge, for no reason other than that she wanted to walk, which she did often, in the small determined way of children who have decided they are going somewhere, even if they have not yet decided where. Dr. Sivrath observed this on the second afternoon, and opened a new log entry. He titled it, Liquid Containment Risk, Mobile, Status, Tracking. He noted the cup's approximate volume, its imperfect seal, and the child's trajectory patterns across the lounge floor. And he marked the entry as low priority, but flagged it for monitoring, because Dr. Sivrath had been a ship's physician for 22 years. And he had learned that low-priority flags had a way of becoming relevant very suddenly. He did not mention this log to Commander Velsharath. He did not mention it to Sergeant Osei. He simply watched the small child move through the lounge with her cup, and added an annotation each time she changed direction. And he told himself this was standard medical observation, and not the Velkarath making him anxious about a toddler with a drink. He told himself this several times. By the end of the second day, 14 human children had eaten 3 meals each, run approximately half a kilometer each in aggregate through the lounge and the connected washroom corridor, produced a volume of noise that the ship's acoustic monitoring system logged as comparable to a minor hull stress event, and gone to sleep without serious incident. Commander Velsharath reviewed the day's logs at 2200 from his chair on the bridge. He read through each entry with care, and when he reached Dr. Sivrat's humidity monitoring notes and the annotation about the mobile liquid containment risk, he sat with it for a moment. Then he closed the log. Then he opened it again and read it one more time. He did not issue any new orders. But the next morning, very quietly, he asked the engineering team to inspect the floor grip panels in the main corridor junction, just to make sure they were properly secured. It happened on the afternoon of the third day at 14:23 ship time, in the central corridor junction, a wide four-way intersection that sat between the observation lounge, the medical bay, the main engineering access corridor, and the 2 forward equipment bays that housed the ship's navigation relay systems. It was a high-traffic area. The floor grip panels that Commander Velsharath had quietly asked engineering to inspect were in fact properly secured. He had confirmed this himself that morning, walking the corridor before the children were awake, pressing each panel with his boot heel, telling himself he was doing a routine check. The corridor was clean and wide and well lit, and everything about it was fine. Bex did not care about any of this. Bex had one mission, and it was simple. She was going to find Sergeant Osai. Sergeant Osai had stepped out of the lounge 20 minutes earlier to speak with Dr. Sivrath about the stress fracture case from the transport, which still needed a follow-up scan. She had left Mira nominally in charge, which Mira accepted with the gravity of someone who had been waiting for this responsibility her entire life, and she had told the children she would be back shortly. Bex had waited approximately 4 minutes before deciding that shortly was taking too long. She had her cup, naturally, and she set off across the lounge with the focused walk of a child who knows exactly where she is going, which she did not, but that had never stopped her before. She made it through the lounge door into the side corridor without difficulty. The door was set to open on motion detection for safety, and she turned left because left felt right, which is the navigational logic of all 3-year-olds everywhere. And she moved down the side corridor with her cup in both hands and her small feet making soft sounds on the floor panels. She was very proud of herself for walking by herself on a spaceship. The central corridor junction was ahead. She could see it open up, wider than the hallway she was in, and she picked up her pace a little because she was close now, and close meant almost there, and almost there meant Sergeant Osei. She came around the corner into the junction. Her left foot caught the raised edge of the doorframe between the side corridor and the junction floor. It was a small lip, less than a centimeter, the kind of small that adults step over without noticing, and the kind of small that catches a 3-year-old at exactly the wrong angle. She did not fall. She stumbled, one quick lurching step forward, and her arms swung out instinctively for balance, and the cup, which she had been holding in both hands, swung with them. The lid, which had never fully sealed, came loose. 207 milliliters of plain drinking water, cool, clear, absolutely harmless, flew in a short arc and hit the corridor floor. Wide, flat, splash. The sound it made was small, a soft, quick slap of water on metal, the kind of sound that under normal circumstances would not register over the ambient noise of a working ship, the kind of sound that meant nothing. Bex stood very still. She looked at the water on the floor. She looked at her empty cup. She looked at the water again. Her lower lip began to move. The ship's internal camera in Junction Corridor C7 recorded the following sequence of events across the next 11 seconds, which the incident report would later describe in careful neutral language as a response cascade. At 14:23:14, the water made contact with the floor. At 14:23:15, Vreth Karal, The senior medic, who was passing through the far end of the junction on his way to the medical bay, registered the sound. His Velkaroth fired, and he stopped moving for exactly 1 second before reversing direction and accelerating toward the cub at a speed not consistent with a casual walk. At 14:23:16, the corridor motion sensors in 2 adjacent hallways registered rapid movement. Korath crew members who had no direct line of sight to the junction, but whose nervous systems had picked up on Vrethkaral's body language through the ship's interconnected alert network. It was not a formal alarm. It was something older and faster than a formal alarm. At 14:23:17, the bulkheads on the east and west approaches to the junction slammed shut. This was an automated response to the bio-alert signals spiking from 3 Korath crew members simultaneously. The ship's safety system interpreted coordinated Velkaroth activation as a crew emergency and sealed the nearest non-essential corridors. At 14:23:18, the ship's intercom opened on 3 channels at once. Overlapping Korath voices, none of them saying anything specific yet, all of them saying everything at once in tone alone. At 14:23:19, Dr. Sivrath came through the medical bay door at a speed that was impressive for an amphibious creature, carrying a large absorbent containment kit under both arms. The kit was designed for biological spill events in surgery. It was the size of a folded mattress. At 14:23:20, Commander Velsharath, who was on the bridge, received a biometric alert, saw 11 Korath stress signatures spiking in the same location, stood up from his chair without a word, and left the bridge. At 14:23:21, the ship's AI registered a Code 7 emergency and began preparing an incident dispatch for Coalition Fleet Command. Standard procedure for any event triggering simultaneous Velkaroth activation in more than 5 crew members. At 14:23:24, the first Korath crew member reached Bex. Bex, surrounded on all sides by bulkhead doors and converging footsteps and the overlapping sound of the ship's intercom, looked up. There were very large eyes looking back at her, wide and dark, and completely focused on her. To a very large face attached to a very large body that had arrived in front of her at a speed that seemed impossible. And then there were more. 2 more coming from the right, 1 from behind. Dr. Sivrath arriving with his enormous kit. The commander himself rounding the corner from the bridge access corridor at a controlled run. 11 Korath crew members formed a loose circle in the junction, around 1 very small human child, and approximately 200 milliliters of water on the floor. The silence lasted about a second and a half. Then Bex, who had been holding her breath since the stumble, looked at all the large faces looking at her, and she did the only thing that made complete sense to her in that moment. She burst into tears. Not small quiet tears, loud, committed, full-body tears, the kind that involve her whole face and both her fists pressed against her eyes, and a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a wail, rising in pitch. Korath, in the junction, responded to this the same way. Their pupils dilated, their shoulders came up, their hands moved forward, and then stopped, because they did not know what to do with their hands. The crying was data, and the data said injury, and injury said act. But there was no wound to treat, and no threat to remove, and the crying kept going, and not one of them knew how to make it stop. Commander Velsharath went down on 1 knee on the wet corridor floor, the water soaking immediately through his uniform. And he looked at the small child at eye level, and said, in the careful, slow tones of his translator working hard, "Small one, where does it hurt? Tell me where it hurts." Bex could not tell him where it hurt, because Bex did not hurt anywhere. She was crying because she had spilled her water, and that was sad, and also because there were now 11 enormous aliens staring at her from every direction, and that was a lot. Corridor intercom was still open on 2 channels. The Code 7 alert was still processing. Dr. Sivrath had set down his containment kit, and was now holding a medical scanner 2 inches from Bex's face, reading her vitals with the focused terror of a man who expected the readings to be bad. They were not bad. Heart rate elevated, respiratory rate elevated, no physical trauma, no injury of any kind. She was upset. She was not hurt. He read the data 3 times because he did not entirely believe it. Sergeant Osei heard the bulkheads close from the medical bay corridor. She heard the intercom. She heard the crying, and she recognized that cry. She had heard that exact cry before, and she was already moving before the second bulkhead finished sealing, pressing her hand to the emergency release panel on the corridor door, stepping through and running. Sergeant Osei came through the junction corridor door at speed and stopped. She took in the scene the way a person takes in a very large painting. All at once, the whole picture. 11 Korath crew members in a loose circle. Dr. Sivrath, with a scanner the size of a dinner plate, pointed at a child's face. Commander Velsharath on one knee in a puddle. 2 crew members in the back, holding items they had apparently grabbed to offer the child. One of them had a ration pack. One of them was holding what appeared to be a navigation crystal. And in the center of all of it, Bex, red-faced and heaving, in the full commitment of a 3-year-old cry. Osei closed her eyes. She breathed in once through her nose. She breathed out. She opened her eyes and walked forward through the ring of large bodies, which parted for her immediately, because every Korath present had been waiting for her with enormous relief. And she went straight to Bex, dropped to her knees, and put both hands gently on the small girl's shoulders. Hey, she said, quiet and even, not loud, not urgent. Hey, I am here. Bex looked at her through wet eyes, a long searching look, and the crying began to slow, moving from wails to hitching sobs, because Sergeant Osei's voice was the specific frequency of safe. What happened? Osei asked, still quiet, still even. Bex raised one arm and pointed at the floor, the water, still sitting there in its shallow splash, and then she held up the empty cup. Spilled, Bex said, her voice thick and small, and her lower lip wobbled again at the word, because saying it out loud made it real. Sergeant Osei looked at the puddle. She looked at Bex. She said, okay, that is okay. Spills happen. Do you want to help me clean it up? Bex sniffled, a long wet sound, and blinked, and the wobble in her lips slowed. Osei reached into the small kit she carried on her belt. She always carried it, always had, because children and small emergencies were the same category of thing in her experience. And she pulled out a square cloth, soft and absorbent, and held it out. Bex took it with both hands, looked at it, looked at the puddle. She got down on both knees on the corridor floor. She began to wipe. She wiped with enormous concentration, pressing the cloth flat, moving it in small, careful strokes across the wet metal. And the circle of 11 Korath crew members watched this in absolute silence. Not one of them moving, not one of them speaking, every one of them operating at the outer edge of their cognitive capacity, trying to process what they were seeing. The cub was cleaning up her own mess. She was not being helped. She was doing it. Small hands pressing the cloth against the floor, pushing the water into the weave, working her way across the puddle with the serious focus of someone who had been given an important task, intended to do it correctly. It took 1 minute and 40 seconds. When she was done, Bex sat back on her heels and looked at the floor, dry now, or close to it. And then she looked up at Sergeant Osei and held out the wet cloth in both hands. All done, Bex said, and she smiled, the gap-toothed wide smile of a child who has accomplished something, proud, simple, completely satisfied. Commander Velsharath stood up from his knee very slowly. He was still standing in the wet patch where the water had been, his uniform dark at the knee, and he stood at his full height and looked at the dry floor, and looked at the child, and looked at Sergeant Osei, and something moved across his face that his translator could not have put into words, even if he had tried to speak. He walked around the corner, past the junction, into the side corridor, and stood there. Just stood there. Vreth Karal, the senior medic, watched him go and then looked down at the navigation crystal still in his own hand, the one he had grabbed off his belt to offer a crying child, and he looked at it for a long moment before quietly putting it back. Dr. Sivrath lowered his scanner. He looked at his readings. No injury, vitals returning to baseline, emotional state normalizing. And he looked at the floor where the spill had been, which was now dry. And he said nothing, because there was nothing in his training that had prepared him with the right words for this specific moment. Bex, unaware that she had just performed something remarkable, stood up and held out her empty cup to Sergeant Osei. "More water?" she asked. Osei took the cup. "Yes, we will get you more water. Come on." She took Bex's hand, and they walked back toward the lounge. Two of the Korath crew members fell in behind them, without being asked. They could not help it. The Vel'Karath had not fully released, and probably would not for another hour. And Osei did not send them back, because she understood that it would not have worked anyway. Commander Vel'Sharath returned from the side corridor when the footsteps had faded. The junction was empty now. Just him, and the dry floor, and the corridor lights humming at their steady, even pitch. He looked at where the puddle had been. He thought about the small cloth in small hands, the focused, careful strokes, the held-out cloth at the end, all done, the smile. He thought about how the child had cried from the surprise of it, and then accepted the cloth, and then done the work, and then been satisfied and moved on. The whole arc of it, in under 2 minutes, clean and complete, no residue, no fear, just a thing that happened and then did not happen anymore. He had seen Korath adults take 3 days to recover emotionally from incidents less significant than a child's spill. He thought about that for a while, on the corridor wall, and pressed the channel open. "Engineering, you can stand down the code 7. The situation has been resolved." And he closed the channel before anyone could ask him to describe the resolution. He went back to the bridge and sat in his chair, and pulled up the incident log that the ship's AI had begun preparing for Fleet Command. He looked at the category field. Code 7 Emergency, Active Threat Response. He changed it to Minor Environmental Event, Self-Resolved. He was still sitting with that log open when Sergeant Osei appeared in the bridge doorway 20 minutes later. Bex was not with her. Bex had been returned to the lounge with a full cup. And Osei leaned against the doorframe and looked at him. "She was not hurt," she said. "I know," he said. Dr. Sivrath confirmed it. A pause. Commander Osei said, gentle, not accusing. "She spilled her water. That is all that happened. She spilled her water, and—" She cried a little, and she cleaned it up. Vel'Sharath was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the console, his eyes on the incident log, and then he said, "She cleaned it herself. Yes. She is 3 years old. She cleaned her own spill, without being asked. She just did it." Sergeant Osei studied him, the large, still form of him, the careful way he was holding himself together, and she understood that what she was looking at was not embarrassment. It was not professional frustration. It was something more honest than either of those things. He was moved. This enormous alien commander, who had triggered a ship-wide emergency response over a puddle, was sitting in his chair genuinely moved by the sight of a toddler wiping a floor with a cloth. "They do that," Osei said. "They make a mess and they feel bad about it, and they want to fix it. That is just how they are." Vel'Sharath looked at her. "Your species produces cubs that want to fix what they break." "Most of the time, yes." Another pause, longer this time. And when he spoke again, his translator rendered it carefully. "Your species is very strange, Sergeant Osei." She laughed. A short, real laugh. "Yeah," she said. "We get that a lot." She pushed off the doorframe to leave, and then she stopped, and she turned back. "For what it is worth," she said, "she was not scared of any of you. Not even a little. She just needed a familiar face. And that means something, from her, because she is not a child who trusts easily." She left. The commander sat with that for a long time. The last day on the Undying Mercy arrived the way last days always do, a little faster than expected, and carrying a weight that nobody had anticipated. The Coalition way station appeared on the long-range sensors at 0600, and by 0800, the docking procedures were underway, and by 1100, the relief vessel that would carry the children to the nearest human settlement had finished boarding clearance, and was sitting at the adjacent dock with its airlock open. Sergeant Osei spent the morning doing what she always did, organizing, counting, checking faces, making sure everyone had their bag, making sure everyone had eaten, making sure Bex had her cup. Bex had her cup. She had refilled it herself that morning, standing on her toes at the water dispenser in the lounge, very focused, tongue slightly out, which was how she concentrated, and she had carried it to breakfast and back without incident, which Sergeant Osei logged internally as a personal victory. Crew was quiet, in the way that specific kind of quiet is, when everyone feels something and nobody has the right words for it. Vreth Karal, the senior medic, spent the morning reorganizing his medical bay with unnecessary precision, moving things from one shelf to another and back again, which was not a thing he did on ordinary days. But this was not an ordinary day. Dr. Sivrath closed out the logs he had been keeping since the children arrived. The biometric monitoring, the environmental notes, the mobile liquid containment tracking file that was still open in his system. And he sat looking at them for a moment before writing his final summary, which he titled, Pediatric Human Passenger Transit Event, Resolution Notes. He wrote 2 lines. The first, all 14 juvenile human passengers transferred in good health, with no lasting incidents. The second, crew response calibration, requires review. He thought about adding a 3rd line, and then decided that too was enough. Mira, the 9-year-old, spent the morning saying goodbye to the 2 Korath crew members she had spent the last 3 days teaching her card game to, a trading game with no fixed rules that she had invented herself over the course of the transit, adding new rules whenever she was losing, which the Korath crew members had accepted with complete seriousness because they assumed the rules were culturally important. She taught them the final hand sequence twice. They wrote it down in their crew notebooks, and she gave them one of her cards as a reference, a slightly bent rectangle with a star drawn on it in blue crayon. They accepted it as if she were handing them a formal diplomatic document. She hugged them both, which they did not know how to receive, and stood very still for, and she said, "You are both very good at this game, and also, you are extremely tall, which I think is excellent." Neither of them could respond to this, in any language, but they were both still holding their notebooks very carefully when she walked away. Commander Velsherith came to the lounge at 1000 to let Sergeant Osei know the transfer schedule. This was something he could have sent through the ship's communication system. He was aware of this. He came anyway. The children were moving around the lounge, doing the quiet, busy things that children do in the last hour before a journey, checking bags, finding missing things, sitting close together in small groups, and Velsherith stood in the doorway and watched for a moment before he found Osei. He told her the schedule. She thanked him. A pause settled between them that held more than either of them said. Then something small hit the back of his knee, not hard, not alarming, just contact, and he looked down. Bex was there, cup in hand, looking up at him from what was, from her perspective, a very significant height, and she said, "He went down to one knee." He had done this before in this corridor, and it had cost him a uniform. But he had learned. "I am," he said through the translator. Bex considered him with the full seriousness of a 3-year-old conducting an evaluation, and then she held out her cup. It took him a moment to understand what she was doing. She was sharing. She was offering him a drink from her cup, the cup she carried everywhere, the cup that was hers in the complete way. She was holding it out to him with both hands, and looking at him, and waiting. Commander Velsherith, who had commanded this vessel for 9 years, who had overseen 47 rescue operations, who had received formal citations from 3 different coalition councils, looked at the small blue cup being offered to him by a 3-year-old human child. He accepted it with both hands. He made a small show of drinking. He did not actually drink. The cup had a different biology requirement, but he brought it to his lips and nodded very seriously and said, "Thank you." Bex took the cup back, satisfied, and walked away to find her bag. The commander stood back up. Sergeant Osei was watching him. He said nothing. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The transfer took 40 minutes. The children moved through the docking corridor in a line, bags on backs, the smallest ones held by Osei. Mira walking at the front, because she had appointed herself there 3 days ago, and nobody had argued. And the Korath crew stood along the corridor in a loose, informal line that nobody had organized, because nobody had needed to organize it, because they had all arrived there on their own. Bex walked past each of them with her cup. She stopped at Vreth Karal, who was nearest the airlock, and looked up at him, and he crouched down to her level, because he had learned this from watching the commander do it. And Bex patted his arm 3 times in the way she patted things she liked. And then she walked through the airlock. The last sound she made on the Undying Mercy was the soft tap of her small feet on the docking corridor floor. Then the airlock sealed. The relief vessel disengaged at 11:47 and moved out toward the shipping lane. And then it was gone. Just the stars and the way station and the quiet hum of the Undying Mercy sitting at dock. Commander Vel Sharath returned to the bridge and reviewed the incident report he had filed the previous day. The Code 7 reclassified to minor environmental event, self-resolved, and he approved it and sent it to Fleet Command. The response came back in 40 minutes. Fleet Command acknowledged the report, reclassified the incident as administrative, and attached a document. The subject line read, "Reminder, Human Juvenile Passenger Protocols, Updated Field Reference, all coalition vessels." Document was 42 pages long and had been revised 4 times in the last 2 years, which suggested it was needed often. Commander Vel Sharath opened the introduction and read the first paragraph, which said the following: "Human children will fall down. They will make noise. They will spill things. They will break things. They will cry, and then stop crying, and then move on. None of this is an emergency. None of this requires Code 7. Please read this document before transporting human juvenile passengers." At the bottom of the introduction, below the formal Fleet Command signature, someone had added a note in plain text, unsigned, unformatted, clearly written by a person rather than a department. It said, "They are tougher than they look, and braver than they know, and they will trust you before you deserve it. Try to be worth it." Vel Sharath read that line twice. He read it a 3rd time. Then he sent the document to the full crew roster, with a brief note of his own. Required reading, no exceptions. Also well done today. He sat back in his chair and looked at the stars through the bridge window. The same stars Bex had called the Big Dark with lights in it. And he thought that was actually not a bad description. 3 days later, deep in the crew quarters corridor, taped to the door of Vreth Karal's bunk with medical adhesive, there was a slightly bent playing card with a star drawn on it in blue crayon. It stayed there for the rest of the ship's service life. Nobody ever moved it.